You were told the 21st century had a winner: liberal democracy, free markets, open societies. That was supposed to be the final chapter of political evolution. Then China rewrote the script without asking permission. A one-party state became the manufacturing core of the planet, a system led by the Chinese Communist Party, integrated into global capitalism without dissolving its authority. Instead of converging toward Western political norms, it absorbed global trade, capital, and technology while tightening centralized control. That contradiction is not theoretical. It is visible in ports, supply chains, artificial intelligence labs, and digital payment ecosystems that process billions of transactions daily. The assumption that economic openness guarantees political liberalization collapsed quietly, replaced by a more complex reality. So pause for a moment. If modernization does not automatically produce the same political outcome everywhere, then what exactly are we witnessing? Not the return of orthodox socialism, not the triumph of pure capitalism. Something more adaptive, something engineered. And if one system can evolve beyond the categories that defined the last century, how many other assumptions about power, governance, and the future are about to be challenged?
The illusion of labels. Why socialism no longer means what you think. The debate usually begins with a simple question. Is China socialist or capitalist? That question feels logical, but it traps you inside an outdated frame. The moment you choose one label, you miss the architecture. In classical theory, socialism meant collective ownership and planned economies. Capitalism meant private property and market coordination. In modern China, both mechanisms operate, but neither defines the whole system. Markets allocate resources in many sectors. Private entrepreneurs build global companies. At the same time, strategic industries remain guided, capital flows are monitored, and political authority sits above economic power. The word socialism inside China does not function as a rigid economic blueprint. It operates as a legitimizing narrative for centralized direction. It signals continuity with revolutionary history while justifying long-term national planning. That distinction matters. The term anchors identity, but the structure adapts. This is why external observers often misread the system. They search for ideological purity and find inconsistency. In reality, flexibility is the design. The state can expand market space when growth requires it and restrict it when stability demands it. So the first mental shift is simple but uncomfortable. Stop asking whether China fits the definition of socialism. Start asking how it uses the definition strategically. And once you accept that labels can be instruments rather than truths, a deeper question emerges. If ideology becomes a tool instead of a constraint, what does that do to the way power is exercised?
The engineering of stability. How risk is managed at a civilizational scale. If you want to understand modern China, stop looking for dramatic political theater. Look at how it handles risk. Because the core obsession of the system is not ideological purity, it is stability. In many democracies, crises unfold in public view. Markets crash, governments debate, institutions negotiate in real time. In China, disruption is treated as a threat to systemic continuity. The instinct is containment before exposure, adjustment before escalation. Financial bubbles are not simply economic concerns, they are political variables. Social unrest is not framed as dissent alone, it is treated as instability that must be neutralized quickly. Regulation can tighten overnight. Entire sectors can be restructured within months. The speed may surprise external observers, but inside the logic of the system, rapid correction is a feature, not a flaw. This approach is rooted in scale.
Governing over 1 billion people requires anticipating shockwaves before they spread. Centralized authority allows intervention without prolonged public negotiation. That creates a different rhythm of governance. Fewer public disputes, more internal calibration. But here is the tension you should feel. Stability achieved through control demands constant vigilance. The higher the expectation of order, the lower the tolerance for unpredictability. Every slowdown, every financial tremor, every external pressure becomes a stress test. And this leads to the next strategic dimension. If managing risk is central, then time itself becomes a weapon, because the ability to think in decades instead of election cycles changes how a nation competes. Time as a weapon, the power of multi-decade political patience. Here is an advantage most people underestimate. In China, political continuity is not interrupted by election cycles every few years. The leadership structure under the Chinese Communist Party allows strategic objectives to stretch across decades without being reset by partisan turnover. Think about what that means in practical terms. Infrastructure projects are designed with 30-year horizons. Industrial policies target sectors that may take a generation to mature. Technological self-sufficiency plans are pursued even when short-term returns are uncertain. The system tolerates delayed gratification if it aligns with long-term positioning. In contrast, many democratic governments operate under immediate political pressure. Leaders must deliver visible results within a narrow time frame. Policy continuity depends on electoral outcomes. Strategic patience competes with voter impatience. This difference reshapes competition. When one system optimizes for the next quarter and another optimizes for the next quarter century, the tempo of decision-making diverges. Short-term volatility can be absorbed if the long-term trajectory remains intact. But political patience is not automatic strength. It requires internal discipline, controlled succession, and consistent elite alignment. If factions emerge or economic momentum weakens, long timelines can become liabilities rather than assets. Still, the capacity to plan beyond immediate popularity grants a structural edge in sectors like advanced manufacturing, artificial intelligence, and energy transition. Now ask yourself something deeper. If time can be centralized and directed like capital, how does that reshape national identity and emotional cohesion? Nationalism 2.0, the emotional architecture of modern identity. Power does not endure on structure alone. It endures on belief. And in China, belief has been carefully modernized. The narrative is not framed as ideological struggle anymore. It is framed as national revival. The message repeated across media, education, and political discourse is simple and emotionally charged. A civilization that once suffered humiliation is reclaiming its rightful place. The Chinese Communist Party positions itself as the vehicle of that restoration. This is not old revolutionary rhetoric. It is strategic nationalism adapted for a digital age. Pride in technological breakthroughs, pride in infrastructure, pride in global influence. Economic success becomes proof of historical correction. When citizens internalize the idea that national strength equals personal dignity, loyalty deepens. Criticism can be framed not just as disagreement with policy, but as weakening collective progress. That emotional shift changes the psychological terrain of politics. And here is the subtle brilliance. Nationalism reduces reliance on pure ideological persuasion. You do not have to constantly defend abstract theory when tangible development reinforces confidence. High-speed rail, global tech brands, and space missions become symbols of competence. But emotional cohesion must be continuously nourished. External tensions, economic slowdowns, or social inequality can strain the narrative of inevitable ascent. Which brings us to a strategic crossroads. If national identity is fused with global integration, how does a state engage with the world without losing control over its internal direction? The strategic use of globalization without surrendering control. Most countries that opened their economies gradually diluted political centralization. China chose a different path. It stepped into globalization, but it never handed over the steering wheel. When China joined global trade institutions, attracted foreign capital, and became the factory floor of the world, many assumed integration would reshape its political core. Instead, integration became fuel. Access to markets accelerated industrial growth. Foreign investment transferred knowledge. Export surpluses strengthened state capacity. But openness was never unconditional. Capital flows were monitored, key sectors remained shielded, technology partnerships were absorbed, localized, and scaled domestically. The system welcomed globalization as a tool, not as an ideology. The Chinese Communist Party did not interpret global participation as submission to external norms. It interpreted it as leverage. Trade created mutual dependence. Supply chains intertwined economies. Influence expanded without formal alliances. This selective openness required precision. Too much restriction would scare investors. Too much freedom could weaken centralized oversight. So the model evolved into calibrated exposure, connected enough to benefit, controlled enough to preserve authority. And this is where the tension tightens. If globalization is used strategically rather than embraced philosophically, then innovation becomes the next battlefield. Because absorbing technology is one thing, leading it is another. Can a system that supervises markets also unleash breakthrough creativity at the frontier of science and technology? Innovation under supervision. Can creativity thrive inside constraint? Here is the paradox that keeps analysts awake. Breakthrough innovation is often associated with open debate, decentralized experimentation, and intellectual friction. Yet China is racing forward in artificial intelligence, advanced manufacturing, biotechnology, and space technology under a system led by the Chinese Communist Party. So how does this work? The answer lies in directed ambition. Innovation in China is not left entirely to spontaneous market forces. It is prioritized, funded, and strategically guided. Entire ecosystems are built around national goals. Universities align with industrial policy. Venture capital flows towards sectors identified as critical for sovereignty. This creates scale. When the state declares semiconductors or electric vehicles a priority, capital mobilizes, research accelerates, and local governments compete to support the push. Speed becomes an advantage. But supervision comes with boundaries. Speech, information flows, and political discourse remain controlled. The question is whether intellectual constraint limits disruptive thinking or whether disciplined focus channels creativity toward applied breakthroughs. The system bets on alignment over chaos. It assumes coordinated direction can compensate for reduced ideological pluralism. So far, the results in manufacturing scale and rapid commercialization are visible. The deeper test lies in foundational scientific discovery. And that tension opens the next chapter. Even the most coordinated innovation strategy must confront structural realities. Demographics, labor markets, and generational expectations cannot be engineered as easily as industrial policy. The demographic reckoning. Growth in an aging civilization. For decades, momentum masked vulnerability. A vast labor force powered factories, urban expansion, and export dominance in China. That era is shifting. The population is aging, birth rates are falling, the demographic pyramid is tightening at the base. This is not a distant issue. It strikes at the foundation of the growth model. Fewer young workers mean higher labor costs, slower expansion, and increased pressure on social systems. An aging society demands healthcare, pensions, and long-term care infrastructure on a scale never seen before in China's modern history. The leadership of the Chinese Communist Party understands the stakes. Automation, robotics, and artificial intelligence are not just technological ambitions, they are demographic strategies. Productivity must compensate for population decline. Innovation must replace sheer workforce size. But numbers tell only part of the story. Expectations have changed. Younger generations, raised in relative prosperity, measure success differently. Career competition is intense. Housing affordability challenges optimism. Economic slowdown feels sharper when people were conditioned to constant acceleration. The system now faces a delicate recalibration. It must maintain confidence without relying on double-digit growth. It must protect stability while navigating structural transition. And this is where everything converges. Labels, stability engineering, long-term planning, nationalism, globalization, and supervised innovation all meet a single test. Can this model adapt not during expansion, but during constraint? The answer to that question determines more than China's future. It shapes the balance of global power.
The end of ideological monopolies. For most of the modern era, one belief dominated global politics. There was a single destination for developed societies. Liberal democracy paired with free market capitalism was presented not just as successful, but as inevitable. China disrupted that certainty without launching a crusade or exporting a revolution. It simply grew. Under the direction of the Chinese Communist Party, it industrialized at historic speed, integrated into global markets, built technological capacity, and maintained centralized authority. No dramatic ideological conversion, no abandonment of one-party rule, just consistent expansion of capability. That alone altered the global psychological landscape. When multiple governance models demonstrate viability, ideological monopoly collapses. Nations begin to compare outcomes instead of doctrines. Infrastructure speed, crisis management, technological scale, social stability. The competition shifts from moral argument to structural performance. This is the silent transformation of the 21st century. The debate is no longer about which system sounds more virtuous. It is about which system adapts faster under pressure. And that changes everything. Because once certainty dissolves, experimentation begins. Alliances become pragmatic. Hybrid models emerge. Political imagination expands beyond inherited categories. So here is the lasting impact. China did not just rise economically, it reopened the question of how power can be organized in the modern world. The century ahead will not be defined by the loudest ideology. It will be shaped by the systems that endure, evolve, and deliver. And now the question is not what China proves. The question is what the rest of the world learns.